Hi, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. My name is Keith Damer-Donzer. I'm a principal consultant with Ivar Jacobsen International and the SAFE SBCT. The topic of this presentation or webinar is about writing better stories. And we're talking about stories in the context of SAFE specifically here. If you have been tuned into the previous webinars, you'll know that this is the third of a set of three. You could collect the whole set if you go and watch them on YouTube. So previously, there was a webinar by Brian Tucker about safe epics, and that is on YouTube if you want to catch that again. At the 1st of August, Brian did a webinar about safe features, and again, that's now up and available on YouTube. So today we're completing the set, and I'm going to talk about stories or user stories, but in the specific situation of use them in Scaled Agile Framework, SAFE. So let's just get started at the very beginning. What are we talking about here, and what are these stories, and what are they not? That's a useful thing to think about. So let's go back and look at some descriptions or definitions. Now, I don't know if you're a follower of Ivar Jacobsen International. We've had quite a few webinars recently. And one of the webinars in the last few weeks was with Mike Cohen. And in that webinar, he shared this definition with me. And he said, hey, a user story is a short, simple statement telling us something that a user or a customer wants. And it's often described as a promise for a conversation. So we're starting to get a feel about what these things are. It's short, it's simple, it's concise, and it's focused about what the user wants, not what we are going to do. An alternate one, which is also very useful, is from the actual inventor of extreme programming, because the whole concept of stories or user stories comes from XP back in the 90s. And so Bill Wake, who was a co-inventor of that, he said, hey, stories are like a pidgin language. And pidgin language, as you probably know, is, hey, a kind of simplified language that can be used by different people who actually speak in a different language, different tongues, so they can actually communicate each other. And of course, that's true, isn't it? If we're talking to users who come from a certain world and from customers and business, and we have other people who are talking as software developers or analysts, they literally have a very different lexicon and a different expectation. So here's a pidgin language where both sides, users and developers, can agree enough to work together effectively. So in Bill Wake's definition, it's really interesting because he's showing how this is an important thing to actually share that communication and understanding between the people who want the stuff and the people who are going to make the stuff. So I find these quite useful. Now, as you probably know, you could write your stories or user stories in a template that is the Connextra template invented by people in a company in London back in 2001. And it goes, as a user type, whatever the user type is, I want to do this thing so that I can achieve this, value, this success. Very simple, just a sentence, but it does make sure that we know who's it for, what do they want to do, and why do they want to do it. Now, I've said you could write the story using that template, and it is sort of helpful, but I don't think you need to bend over backwards in order to conform explicitly to the template, but you do need to think about what's the purpose and what is the information that I would like to capture that's talking about what is it that the person who wants to use the story wants, not what I'm actually going to do necessarily or any internals. So if you go back and think about what the Agile Manifesto was talking about, well, they said, hey, we want to prioritize individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So, hey, yes, you could use the template, but the most important thing is, as Bill Wake said, it's a way to bring together the people that want the stuff with the people who are going to make the stuff and get them communicating effectively. And it's collaboration, so you have to think about when you write a user story, have you talked to the user? Maybe, maybe not. Other characteristics, if you want to think about how can you write a good story or user story, and I tend to use the terms interchangeably, user story and story, quite frankly, then these different pieces of guidance are very useful. And you may well have come across these. Ron Jeffries, back in the day, came up with this idea about the 3 C's. It's the card, conversation, and confirmation. And back in those days, they used to encourage people to write their stories on small pieces of cards, little index cards, and if you're as old as me, you'll remember going to the library and every single book would have been written on these and you'd go sneaking through. So these were a common sort of piece of paper in a format around. And it's very small, okay, so you can't get that much on one side of this card, which means that we only want to create a very concise description of what it is that the user wants on there, because this is not the definitive requirement, basically. What do we want to do? Well, this is a promise for a conversation. That's what we saw earlier, Mike Cohen mentioning. So really, this is not the conveyor of all of the information. It's the conversation with the user or whoever it is that wants the stuff, for us to get a much richer understanding. And that's clearly what the Agile Manifesto was trying to encourage us to do, individuals and interactions. Finally, what they often used to write on the other side was, how do we confirm that we finished it? What's the confirmation? And that might be a set of checklist items, the acceptance criteria. I have done this story and delivered the right value if it does X, Y, and Z. So making sure that each user story follows these ideas means that you follow the spirit of what we're trying to do with user stories or stories. And also it means that you are focusing on that conversation and interaction where you can have a much higher bandwidth exchange with the person who's the expert. The other thing to think about is, you're going to be doing this work, but it's not the only user story or story that you're working with. There's probably going to be several, and they're probably going to be prioritized against each other. So Bill Wake also came up with this really nice acronym. You want to invest in your good stories, i.e. for each story you write, you want it to be independent of the other stories, which are going to be in that prioritized list inside that backlog, which means if I change the order and put this higher up in the backlog, I don't have to move other ones to go with it because there's no dependencies. So that's a really powerful thing, but it makes you think about how you need to write the user story. It's independence within the items which are in the backlog, and we don't necessarily want to have that many items in that backlog. So that's the other thing to realize in the background here, that clearly it's hard to write things that are completely independent of absolutely everything else. But in terms of the time box of what we're working on, this might be a realizable thing. The second thing he says is N for negotiable. So you should be able to negotiate it. It was a promise for a conversation where we agree, the user and myself, what I'm actually going to do. They've got some ideas, they know what they need, I know what can be done. So again, it's not a fixed requirement or specification that must be followed. We're going to make that agreement, and we're looking for that negotiation to take place here. It must be valuable, okay? It must be something that the user wants, or more generally the customer wants. Otherwise, why would you bother spending time doing it? And E, you should be able to estimate it. It should be estimable. We want to understand the scope of the work, and we want to make sure that the investment that we put in, is worth the return on the investment, the value which was described in invest. So which means we need to be able to say how long it will take. And if you can't estimate something, then clearly the scope is not clear and we don't really understand it. So that's a good test of that understandability, as well as starting to let us think about the return on investment of doing this work. Finally, we're getting closer to stories should be small, and we're going to talk about later. Certainly the ones that you're going to end up doing as a story, they have to fit within your iteration. That's what XP said back in the 90s, although their iterations were, I think, maybe a month in their times. That's going to be true when we talk about SAFe as we move on to that as well. Of course, stories which are not going to be done, for a long time, they don't need to be small, and I wouldn't waste my time making them small enough in case I never end up doing them. So that's why it also says sized appropriately. So if they're at the bottom of the backlog, don't waste your time making them small, but if they're at the top, they must be. Finally, we need to be able to test that we have actually delivered it. And so it should be testable. And that goes back to the confirmation of the card conversation confirmation side. I need to be able to demonstrate that I've actually done everything I said I would do. The acceptance criteria have been proved. So these are very simple, but they're very useful. And they were, even if they were invented in the 90s or the early 2000s, I still think they're very good guidance to help you understand if your stories are good or if they could be improved if you're looking for sort of coaching opportunities. And I think the key takeaway is, irrespective of how you write them, if you follow the as a I want so that, or if you write them in a slightly different way, you have to be really clear about who wants this thing and what value is it going to deliver to them. It's talking about what value are we going to give. I've used the term customer at the top of here instead of user because, as you probably know, it's a bit more complex than just making the user happy. Because yes, I absolutely want to make the user happy, but of course, the customer may not be the user. Okay, so they must also want to buy the thing that I'm making. And my company probably wants to make sure that it wants to make me to spend the time to build it. And so the builders have to have a perspective. So we'll probably be thinking much more about, a wider stakeholder group, basically. But in any case, we need to know who wants this and to be confirmed that each of the stories is valuable. And I've said here, well, that is the day job of the product owner, to make sure that we're only doing things that they are happy are valuable and they know who the value is for. I've written a list in this sort of blue first, second, third, fourth, which may be defensible, maybe not, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the best user stories are probably actually going to do something that the user themselves could actually understand, or maybe the customer of the solution. But if you can't do that, then maybe look internally and try to satisfy your business owners in the safe world or stakeholders, because there's still some other aspects of your customer or stakeholder. If you can't do that, then look to writing stories that are supporting your direct customers as a development team, which are other teams or other trains, okay, maybe helping put stuff together end to end much more quickly than it otherwise would be able to do. And then right at the bottom of the list, you might choose to do things for yourself as a team, but only if the product owner is really convinced that that actually is useful for the team. So this is just a heuristic, but I'm trying to really make the point that you should be reaching out as much as possible to give as extensive value as you can. Somebody else who's written a lot about stories, and he's going to pop up, and I'm going to introduce some of his other ideas later on in this presentation, is Jeff Patton. And he makes this really nice point. He says effective stories connect everyone to the purpose of the product. And so it's not just a work token telling us, what to do as developers. It's really meant to make us think outside and to think, what is it that we're meant to be serving in terms of our customers or our users? And so we have an understanding and a mental model about what that product is, so we can make that product amazing. Which sort of leads the question about, if that's what user stories are, then what are user stories not? And so here are just some thoughts that I actually had, and I'd be interested in seeing what you have to think as well. But user stories are not requirements, okay, in the traditional sense. It should do this, it should do that kind of stuff. They are transient descriptions of activities that we're going to do that will deliver some benefit to the user, but we're not going to store them away as a permanent record to say what are the requirements of this solution that we're building. And in fact, if you try to do that with your user stories, you'll probably just go mad. They are not designed to do that. They are no use to do that. Don't spend your time trying to treat your user stories like requirements. The other thing that they're not, you can see that user stories are meant to say, hey, what is it that the user wants the system or the solution to do? And so they're not design instructions, make this change to this component to do this. The assumption is that you will work that out yourself, okay? And that's your separate activity. It's not carried inside the information inside the user story themselves. So those are some of the things that user stories are not. And finally, this is what Jeff Patton says: stories aren't a different way to write requirements, they're a different way to work. And that's the profound thing that we're trying to do in any agile way of working. And that's why stories have been taken up as such a powerful way of working in any of the agile methodologies. For instance, Scrum just talks about backlog items. And yet, of course, most people tend to talk about stories specifically rather than just talk about backlog items. So that takes me through the first part. Hopefully this is starting to get your mind racing and thinking about things. Just to remind you, we've got a Q&A space. And so as I go through this presentation and you've got any questions or any thoughts, do put them inside the Q&A, and then we'll come and look at those things at the end when I get to the end of the presentation. Okay, so what's the story so far? You know, if I've introduced what user stories are or what stories are, that was just a very generic description, but this series of webinars is specifically about SAFe. And so how do stories fit into the world of SAFe? Okay, and how important are they? So let's talk about that. And to go into this, I've used some of the pictures that Brian Tucker used when he was doing some of the earlier webinars, just to have some consistency. Brian was showing this description about the relationship of SAFe epics to SAFe features and SAFe stories. And you can see here, if you have an epic in SAFe, then it will be implemented by breaking it down into one or more features, probably several features. And if I have a feature, it will be broken down into one or more, probably several stories. And so we can see that there is this kind of hierarchy there. And it's worth just thinking about, well, how big are these things? And so if we look at the epics, just to remind ourselves what he said in the webinar, you know, epics are big, so they're probably bigger than a SAFe planning interval, than a PI, probably, okay, to do, because if they were smaller, you would have just called it a SAFe feature. And you know, how many people does it span in terms of doing the work? Well, an epic could have all of its features going to a single agile release train, you know, in a special situation, but it also, those features could just go off in all different directions into many agile release trains in many of your development value streams. So it could stretch, the feature could go all over the portfolio. So it really takes a long time. It's got a lot of people working on it in one or more trains. That sounds expensive, and hence that's why there's a business case associated with that. Let's look at features now. Features are time limited, so they're designed so they can be completed by one agile release train in a single PI or less. And in all of these cases, we would like them to be, you know, significantly smaller than the size of a PI. If you remember, in SAFe, a planning interval is, you know, 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks. Often people have 12 weeks, quarterly, or 10 weeks. And so we're saying the feature must be completable by an agile release train in less than that time, so that we get a number of completed features out of the train by the end of the PI. And notice it's by the train as well. They're only, a feature only goes to a single train, but we're not saying whether it is completed by a single team or by all of the teams in a train or some of the teams. It's just up to how the train decides to actually do the implementation. Okay, but from the perspective of SAFe, a feature is matched to a train. And that's why, you know, we have a backlog of features for a train, the ARC backlog. And similarly, if we go back up again, you've got a backlog of epics, and it's for the portfolio because they could span across the whole portfolio. Finally, if we head down to what our topic is today, stories, they are small. They have to be completed in within an iteration, and SAFe suggests 2 weeks as a standard size iteration. And also, hey, stories are only really for a single team, and therefore there will be a single team backlog. And so these really are quite small. How many would it be just fitting inside a single iteration? No, probably you want as a team to do a number of stories in a single iteration. I was looking at a book from Alistair Coburn yesterday, and he said, nothing to do with SAFe, of course, but he was saying, hey, you know, 5 or more stories coming out of a team every iteration or every sprint is, you know, seems like a good number heuristically. So 5 or more. So these things are small when we're talking about stories. And if we know that SAFe features are split into stories, why do we do it? Well, the reason that we break them down into small pieces is because if you look at the lean thinking, well, small batches of work will flow through a team more quickly and with more predictability than a large batch of work. Okay, so it's just a trick that we're using. In fact, we're using it all of the way down. We probably, as a company, just want to do the epics most of the time, but the way that we operate is we break epics into small features, and we break each small feature into a smaller story. And this is really the trick to make it flow through the teams and trains and the organization, and hence allow us to be more productive and less stressed as we do the work, even though it might be the epics that we really, really want. Also, we make the story small enough so we can say at the end of a fixed time box, the iteration, that, hey, look, this is done or it's not done. Is, you know, you don't want to have a whole load of work which is all half done, so we don't really know how it's all going. So we're forcing this artificial time box constraint to say, let's make these stories small enough so they are finished within a single iteration by a single team. And perhaps even more importantly, why do they have to be finished in a single iteration? Well, it's because we would like to get some feedback. We would like to be able to show that stuff to somebody else, the user or somebody else, and see if we're on the right track. Is that the right thing? Should we change anything when we go into the next iteration? So we want to get a small and fast feedback cycle by having small items of work. Now, if we talk about SAFe specifically, there is something that you need to know, because you can look at the picture and say, oh, everything has to come from an epic. Well, it's not true, okay? You can have a user story or a story which is an orphan. You know, the team decides that they're going to write a story, and if it's prioritized by the product owner in the backlog, absolutely fine. And in fact, if you think about it, that's essential, isn't it? Because we need autonomy inside the agile teams. That's meant to be an important part of working as an agile way. So they have to be able to put work into their own backlog without it being approved by somebody else. Now, in SAFe, we would like aligned autonomy because, hey, we know we've got big strategic things to do, the features and the epics, but we still would like to have that wiggle room for the teams to actually do some of their own things. And so, yes, you should be able to have an orphaned story. Also, calling them user stories and saying, hey, it's always for a user. Well, when you're working on very big and complex solutions, that starts to become a little bit more difficult. And so just like in other ways of thinking about providing value to customers, you know, for instance, use cases where you can have actors which are primary actors or supporting actors, which could be other systems or other things outside of the system, we could do that here as well. So the behavior that we're writing and delivering for a story could be for a user or a human, but it also could be for another part of the solution in order to make things work, which is why perhaps, you know, calling them stories is perhaps a little bit more precise than calling them user stories. In SAFe, they've got these two types of stories, two types of features, two types of epics. There's the business ones that provide value to people outside, you know, the users, the customers, and they're often drawn blue in the iconography of SAFe. And then you can also have enablers, and SAFe describe enablers as being, you know, architectural changes, you know, refactoring and those sort of things. They could be things to actually improve the infrastructure, you know, the tools, the scripts, and the CDP pipeline that you've got. Again, that's stuff that the customers and the users don't explicitly care about, but you certainly do as an organization. They could be experiments and exploration just to generate some knowledge or make decisions. You know, in XP, they talk about spikes, story spikes. And so that's exactly what this is speaking about here. And SAFe also says that, hey, enablers could be for compliance, you know, regulatory related things, or, you know, you've got to finish that document or whatever. So we can allow stories in SAFe to also serve those purposes. Finally, the concept of SAFe is very much it's the train that owns the solution, and it's the features that get released to the customer or the customers. Okay, so the features are the releasable points, and they get released individually or clubbed together into releases, i.e. the individual stories are not released independently to the customer, although of course the changes are going to the customer as part of a feature, but they're not releasable independently from the concept of SAFe, because it's the features that are. So that sort of raises the question, doesn't it? Right? If you can't release a single user story to the customer, then why should we care about stories? You know, should we just like do a whole load of work items and just focus on the features? Okay, now that is a tempting way to think about it, but I think that would be a terrible mistake. And this is why, if you think about the features that we actually have already, I said that features must be finished within a single PI, but that means they're going to take weeks, you know, or even a few months to complete in some situations. That's a long time to wait, you know, if you're a customer or a user, or if it's an internal stakeholder trying to work out, is this going to be good stuff? You know, people will be shouting and screaming, where's my stuff? You know, and they don't want to wait. So this is a reason to start thinking about what can we get incrementally as we're building up the feature as we work on individual stories. Now, if you were actually watching one of the previous webinar, you would have seen Brian Tucker, top left on my webinar view today, talking about features. So I think what the best thing that we should do is to remind ourselves what he was talking about by going back in time and just seeing a little bit of that video. So let's, if you just want to get on my time machine with me, and we're just going to watch a little snatch of Mr. Tucker.
Here, now that we've seen what features are, potentially releasable pieces of customer value, a quick look at the journey they go on to become releasable pieces of end user value.
That's all you get. You don't get any more. If you want to watch all of Brian Tucker, you've got to watch the whole video. But the point with this is to reframe it with how we were describing features in the last webinar. Hey, features have a long life cycle. Somebody requests them, you know, we prepare them and then they're ready. Then we commit to them in PI planning. And then, hey, well, they're finished and get accepted at the system demo by the product manager, but there could be weeks or even months in between that period of time. And of course, afterwards, they go off to be released and they live happily ever after. So notice with the life cycle of a feature, certainly as we describe it, is that there is an extra state, intermediate, where we could say, hey, maybe we need to preview these things and show our increment and try and get some feedback. Because if you wait until you've finished the feature and it's not right, well, that's pretty catastrophic, isn't it? So yes, of course, we want to get the feature released and accepted, but let's think about its preview state as well. Let's have a look at this card. These are feature state cards, which you can download from our company website. I've got some QR codes for lots of things that will come up on the last slide at the end. And let's have a look at some of these titles here. You know, it might be useful to show an early version of the feature before it's finished, just to, you know, get key decisions verified. Or maybe to get rid of some unwanted stories because maybe we decide we don't need as much functionality as we originally thought. Or maybe just get the product manager excited about the thing and really understand that it's going to be a really useful feature. Or maybe to show that risks are under control, either technical risks or, you know, business risks. Or maybe show that we can actually build it, which that's how I interpret the viability confirmed. So let's have a think about this. If I want to do these things, clearly I have to do something with the stories rather than the feature, because it's the stories that I'm working on a day-to-day basis. And let's just choose some of these things. Well, how can I get some key decisions verified? Well, I could do a spike, couldn't I? And enable a story that does some analysis and then allows us to make a decision. Or in other situations, I could do some sort of simple demo and then get people to agree based on what they see. If I pick out some other things, how do we get project managers excited and infused? Well, it's not easy, but probably showing them the stuff. You know, let's show a demo of not the whole thing, but just some bits and pieces working to really show them the possibilities. And this is before the feature's finished. Let's choose some other things. How can we show that the risks are under control? Well, hopefully by actually making something. Maybe it's technically complex, so we want to show that our solution actually works, and maybe the architects, you know, will be very satisfied by seeing a demo of that, you know, with all the moving parts operating. These are not the only ways to prove these things, by the way, but I'm just pointing out that some of them could be done with actual demos. And hey, if we want to see if the benefit hypothesis is going to be proven, then again, that might be a demo and get real feedback from the customers and from the users. So I guess you see what I'm trying to say here. Also, can we build it? There's this concept of a walking skeleton. Let's build the minimum stuff just to show that we can make it all work end to end inside our software solution, to give us confidence that actually all the moving parts are going to work and that this whole thing is going to be successful. So that a demo again to architects or to the teams involved might be a really useful early thing to do, even though these are internal things in many cases. So we can see that, in order to do an earlier preview, as we've called it here, we might want to do a single story, but also, can we always do these things just with one single story? Sometimes, but often probably not. Can you create a preview of a single story? Well, it would be best if you can, because hey, it's great to do as much as possible with as least as possible. So aim to do that. But if you need to do a number of stories, then we're going to have to start thinking about which stories, are we going to do in order to do these demos or these incremental internal releases. Which brings us to the final topic of this presentation, story mapping. Okay, if we need to think about how the stories relate to each other for a feature, maybe we need to have some sort of visualization that helps us think and collaborate about these things. Now, the work of story mapping is very much based on Jeff Patton. You saw his name appearing before. He's written this book that's been around for a good while now. I've done some work with him in the last few months, and we've actually created some story mapping cards, and you can download those with this QR code from our company website. Once again, the same QR code will appear right at the end of the slide deck at the Q&A if you want to see that a little bit later. Also, talking to Jeff, he says, if you wrote the book again or if you revised it, you might well call it story mapping. You might drop the user off the story mapping side. So let's see what story mapping is all about, and let's see how it could fit with us in a safe context. The starting point is, hey, we want to work on a feature, okay? And we might have one or more teams who are going to actually work together in order to deliver that feature. Now, just like stories, we want to think, what benefit is that feature going to deliver to our users and the customers? Okay, so we want to think about that. And one way to think about that quite often is, what's the journey that the user is going to go through in order to use this feature, in order to allow them to do the thing that it is that they want to do. And so I've drawn this kind of timeline going from left to right. And we could start by really thinking and talking to the user and other stakeholders, what are the key activities or the key steps that you go through? And we could capture those. So here I've just created 4, the workflow for this feature. The user first does step 1, and then they do step 2, and then they do this thing which we call step 3, and then they do step 4. And we would put the real names of those. This is what Jeff Patton would call the backbone of this story map. And imagine that this is actually on a whiteboard, or it's on a virtual whiteboard, and we're all looking at it and standing around it and working on it together so we can collaborate. Once we've kind of agreed the kind of high-level scope of what it is meant to do, and remember, again, we're looking at it from the perspective of what the customer actually wants. This is the benefit hypothesis, effectively described in steps, and that's a part of the elements of the safe feature. Now we can get our group of people together, which might be a mixture of users, product manager, and the team or teams, and we can start brainstorming. Hey, let's talk about this step 1, this first activity. What user stories should we actually come up with, which would allow us to really provide that overall functionality and behavior to the customer? And we could do some brainstorming. Here they come up with a whole bunch of ideas. And then we could move and talk about step 2, and they've come up with another bunch of ideas, another set of stories, step 3, and then step 4. So we've got this quite big cloud of stories here, but notice that they are organized and arranged, and they're related to the workflow steps. So we know what is the higher level benefit that they're providing, and we should therefore be able to see how each of the stories contributes. It's going to be a part of that larger whole. Now, Scaled Agile do talk about story mapping. I think there's one slide in some of the training courses, and what they say is, hey, then you could agree by drawing a line to say what is the minimum functionality, and moving the stories above the line that you want to be in scope for a minimum marketable feature, and moving the stories below the line, which are kind of nice to have, but hey, we won't do them this time. We might defer those for the future. Now, that's a simple solution and that's useful. So if that works for you, fine. But we could think about it in a different way, because remember that preview card said there are probably many things that we want to do. There's probably many incremental little slices of activity that we would like to work on. So let's think about how else we could do this. Instead, we could have a conversation with the whole group saying, what's the minimum that we should do to create that walking skeleton to show that it is actually going to work? Because we don't really know in terms of the technicality. And here the team has said story underneath step 1 and a few other stories are necessary. They're saying, hey, step 2 is nice, but we don't really need that. It doesn't really prove anything from the technical front, so we don't really care about that. And so that could be our first walking skeleton, so that's an example of one preview that we could do. Who's going to look at that? Well, it's the architects and the teams, to feel confident that we can make this stuff. And the sooner we can do that, the better. So the fewer stories in there, the better as well. Then we could actually start thinking about something else and start thinking, well, okay, what's the next thing that we'd like to do where we could actually start showing something really more substantial, put more flesh on the bones, which the user could then also use and start getting some extra ideas about. And for whatever reason, maybe it's these extra pieces of behavior that the stories that I've actually outlined inside the red are for the second increment, if we called it that, for our preview. And maybe the purpose is just to make the product manager happy because he's not looking very enthusiastic. They often don't. And maybe it's just get him a bit excited to say, yep, this is real work. This is a real goer. We could keep on going and looking at other incremental releases. Maybe there is some specific logic to add for that step 2, but we could do it a little bit later because we're very confident about it. And this is the minimum set that we might continue to actually consider as the third increment. So you can see that I'm actually saying that we could slice things up and have multiple releases for learning or to prove things or to get tangible feedback during working on a single feature. You might also, when you get that feedback from a customer or from the users, actually decide, hey, all of the things that we thought it could do, they said, I want it early. I don't really want the extra stuff. So we've identified a number of stories that actually we just don't need to do. And that was one of the options, wasn't it, on the preview? So you're lucky if you ever get into that situation, but that's a nice thing to be able to do. So you're not gold plating your features all of the time. So I hope you can see that using this kind of concept, which is very simple and it has a very simple structure, allows you to start thinking about how could you work incrementally and what is going to be the scope of each of those previews as we've described them, or demos that you could do before the whole feature is finished. And finally, I want to say that the point about safe features is that, hey, they're not necessarily going to be done by a single team. Don't write your features to keep teams busy. That's a really dumb thing to do. Write features that deliver value to the customer and let the train work out which teams are going to work on it. So having a story map, if you have multiple teams working on it, allows them not only to see what sequence we're going to do and what scope the overall thing is, now, maybe also it's like, well, which team's going to do what? And we can start talking about the sequencing of the work so that we can actually work at the same time. So my team B, they're really good at that functionality, which is really represents whatever step 2 is. Okay, maybe it's a complicated subsystem team and there's some complex stuff in there that they can do. Whereas the other team, team A, they'll do everything else. And they're using the story map to work out how can they collaborate all together. So that's my presentation about stories and introducing groups of stories with story mapping. So let's just wind up with some conclusions and then we can do the Q&A. First of all, from the safe perspective, user stories are not releasable items. Maybe my writing is not perfect there. They're not released independently on their own. They get released as part of the feature, okay? But that doesn't mean that they are not important. I hope you've sort of seen that you should always be thinking about how valuable every single story is. A, because it's your time that you're spending on it if you're a developer and you're expensive, but B, it's the way for us to focus to get the most value to the customers and the users as quickly as possible. Don't just chunk it on a feature. Make every story count, hopefully to the users, but it could be for other stakeholders or other parts of the train. Collaborate and agree. which story or which set of stories are required to learn, and that was talking about spikes, or doing our walking skeleton was an example of learning, if we can do something, or getting concrete feedback. It's easier to give concrete feedback of something real if you're a user or a customer than just if somebody says, well, here's the spec or something, tell us if that's what you want. We can actually see if we're going to be successful, and so we can reduce the risks, either technical or delivery or business risks, sometimes by doing intermediate deliveries. And of course, the sooner we can do earlier end-to-end integration between teams in a train, or even across different trains, if you've got a large solution, the better things actually are, if we can actually think and manage those dependencies. So that's going to be important. Don't treat your stories as requirements and try to treat them as if they're your permanent record. They just don't do that, and it won't work for you. And don't write stories for an individual. Oh, this is for Bob to do some development code, and here's another one for somebody to do some testing. That's not valuable to anybody else except for that individual, is it? So it's not a work task. The story should describe value, and it should be done completely by one or a few people inside the team, including the development and the testing and whatever else is required. And if you want to work on lots of stories, consider using those story maps in the way that I described and showed you there. And especially, because I don't think SAFe is very good at this, if you have multiple teams working together on a single feature, you want a way and a mechanism and a visual tool to help them work out how they're going to work together. Sitting in your own corners in PI planning doesn't really do it, okay? And there's no tangible description in SAFe about how to bring them together. So a story map is a good solution for that. Finally, my takeaway is make user stories great again. The whole point is that they are valuable. They are small, but they're important, because we can get these early demos. We can learn things much more quickly. We get faster feedback. So don't underestimate the value of those things. The red caps will be available from my website afterwards, of course. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Here are the QR codes if you want to get that epic feature story handout, or if you want story mapping download cards that I work with Jeff. Here are the two videos that Brian Tucker did, writing better epics and writing better SAFe features. And if you liked those feature cards that we were showing, then hey, they're also available from our website as well. Thank you very much. What questions do you have?
Okay, so there's a couple that are coming up. Please do add more to the question and answer tool. The first one is story mapping seems fine when there's a user journey involved. A lot of the features I work on don't involve user journeys, meaning there are no steps. For example, create a role, update a role, delete a role. The user might do one of these things, but seldom all of them. How do we use it in that situation?
Yeah, it's not perfect for all situations. In the webinar that we had another webinar with Jeff Patton only a few weeks ago, and he says, hey, they are applicable to system to system type solutions as well, but you have to think about what is the timeline of the activities that your system is trying to work on. So I think even if it doesn't reach out to users, it probably is a sequence of activities that you're actually trying to do. If lots of things are happening in parallel, because it's all asynchronous, then maybe this is not the best way to represent that in that situation.
Okay. So another one that's coming up, the other challenge I face with story mapping is teams who conflate stories with tasks, and you end up with a board full of tech tasks, none of which mean anything to anyone except the developers.
Yes. So the answer to that is don't do that. I think you can see from my webinar, I'm trying to reinforce the fact that when you write these stories, you always have to think from the outside in. That's what Bill Wake was saying. That's what Jeff Patton is saying. That's what Mike Cohen is saying. So who are we to disagree? So if you find that people are doing that, that's really a coaching opportunity, because yes, of course, later on, those team members need to work out what they're going to do. But if they lose sight of the bigger picture, then we're really going to become unmoored, and we're not going to create great products.
Okay. And there's one more that came up in chat, and I can't transfer it across to the Q&A tool, but I'll pull it from chat. Is there anything that should be considered when applying user stories in Scrum compared to the application in the SAFe context?
Sorry, could you repeat that again, Brian?
Okay, so is there anything that should be considered when applying user stories in Scrum compared to the application in the SAFe context?
Yeah, all of the stuff at the early part of the webinar was really stuff that is directly applicable to Scrum. And of course, the difference is that, hey, they are potentially strippable, aren't they? That's what we talk about with backlog items in Scrum. And if your user stories represent backlog items, then hey, it means that really you have the potential for actually shipping and releasing much, much more frequently, story by story, because there's no restriction to Scrum compared to SAFe. But it also puts more focus on the teams to make sure every small thing that they do is an incremental value and is potentially shippable. And so they're doing all of that kind of polishing and finishing. But there's less restrictions, I would say, if you're doing Scrum.
Okay. One last thing that's just popped in. How to include vendor stories and other cross-functional dependencies. I assume that's in relation to if you're doing the story mapping technique and you're creating stories that end up on vendor teams or other release trains outside of the immediate agile release train.
Yeah, so if it's about more people collaborating, it doesn't matter whether the teams that are coming together to use a story map are in the same train or if they're from different departments in the whole company. You know, it's a tool for us to come together and create a sort of virtual group. So if that was the question, hey, it doesn't matter, the story map will bring them all together. If you're trying to represent work that vendors can do, well, clearly they have to understand their what they're offering. And I guess I'd need to know a little bit more about what exactly you mean by a vendor to perhaps answer that in more specific detail, or perhaps that's something that we can answer by email afterwards.
Okay. And one now has come in. So we have UI designers making user stories describing the UI design changes of a feature. Would you call this an enabler story or other alternative to capture this?
So it's a user interface change. Is that right? Is what it's saying?
Yes.
So it presumably has a benefit for the user because it makes it easier for the user to use it. So it just sounds like it is something that the user should want. But hey, we should validate it with the real users, not just necessarily what the UX people say. But I would say that's just a user story. Hey, if it makes it easier for the user to do what they need to do when they use the system, happy days. That's what they'd probably be asking for.
Yeah, so in the blue coloring, basically. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That's it in terms of questions. Still time left. If anyone's got any last they want to drop into the Q&A tool, feel free to do so. But otherwise, I think we're done. Any last comments, thoughts, Keith?
Takeaway really is do access any of these materials that we've got. Don't forget that the earlier webinars are also available. So if you want to catch up with the whole set, then you can actually watch those. Do get in touch with us if you're interested in any of these topics and want to explore them in more detail. And if you want to get some training or some consultancy, of course, we are very happy to offer that as well. But I hope it's been a good use of your hour. I hope there's been something here that's made you think a little bit differently about stories and SAFe that perhaps you hadn't thought about before. Thank you very much.
Thank you.